diving into a challenging and thought-provoking work titled The Reestablishment Project, QUANTAL Aspects of Liberty Integral to American Resurrection by Mark Stephen Weiss, published in 2026. It's a dense, multidisciplinary critique of modern America, focusing on liberty, responsibility, and natural law. Chloe, what struck you most about this book's premise?
Thanks, Liam. Well, what really grabbed me was the author's framing of America as a disunited states of un-America. It's a striking phrase. Weiss argues that the original nation, founded on liberty and responsibility grounded in natural law, no longer exists in any meaningful sense. Instead, what we have today is a society riddled with despotic and tyrannical practices. And the book isn't just calling for reform. It demands a fundamental refounding, a reestablishment of America. That's a bold claim, don't you think?
Absolutely. It's not every day you come across a book that calls for a complete cultural and constitutional renewal rather than incremental change. And the author's background is interesting. He's a political philosopher, behavior analyst, and self-described truth seeker. Plus, the book is dedicated to Thomas Zayas, the psychiatrist known for his fierce criticism of psychiatry and its coercive tendencies. That influence runs deep throughout the text.
Right, Weiss's approach is truly multidisciplinary, blending political philosophy, behavior analysis, and jurisprudence. It's not an easy read, but it challenges many common assumptions about American society, law, and politics. One of the key ideas that stood out to me was his concept of liberty as quantal. He argues that liberty isn't something you can have a little or a lot of. It's indivisible. You either have it or you don't.
That quantal liberty concept is crucial. It pushes back against the common notion that freedom is a spectrum, where some people are more free than others. For example, you can't say someone is half free or mostly free. Certain freedoms are absolute and must be fully protected. And importantly, liberty and responsibility are inseparable. Freedom without responsibility, Weiss warns, leads to chaos or tyranny.
That's a powerful point. The book uses an analogy I found helpful. The U.S. Constitution is like a recipe for a meal, and the current state of America is the meal served. The recipe promises a nourishing, balanced dish, but what we're getting is unpalatable, even toxic. It's a vivid way to illustrate the gap between founding ideals and present reality.
Yeah, that analogy really sticks with you. It's like the founders gave us this carefully crafted recipe, natural law, liberty, responsibility, but somewhere along the way, the ingredients got swapped out, or the cooking process was botched. The result is a dish that doesn't nourish the body politic, but instead makes it sick.
Exactly. And that leads us to the core of Weiss's argument: America's drift away from natural law. He defines natural law as inherent moral principles and rights discoverable by reason, life, liberty, property, that the founders embedded in the Constitution. But modern America has largely abandoned these principles, leading to legal and cultural decay.
Let's unpack that a bit. Natural law is a philosophical idea that certain rights and moral principles are inherent in human nature and can be discovered through reason alone. It's not something granted by government or society, but something that exists independently. The founders leaned heavily on this concept when drafting the Constitution.
Right, and Weiss argues that this foundation has eroded. Instead, we've moved toward positive law, laws created by governments that may or may not align with natural law. This shift, he says, has allowed for despotic laws and cultural decay to take root.
That's a significant critique. It suggests that when laws lose their grounding in natural law, they become arbitrary or oppressive. And that's where the Ninth Amendment comes in, which Weiss highlights as a crucial but often overlooked part of the Constitution.
The Ninth Amendment protects rights not explicitly listed in the Constitution, recognizing broad liberty rights. Yet it's often neglected or misunderstood in legal and political discourse. Weiss elevates the Ninth Amendment as a constitutional safety net for individual liberties that aren't spelled out in detail.
It's interesting because most people focus on the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, but the Ninth Amendment is like the quiet guardian of unenumerated rights. Weiss argues that restoring respect for the Ninth Amendment is essential to reclaiming liberty.
And that ties into his warning about the, quote, tyranny of the majority. He cautions that democratic majorities can impose unjust restrictions on minority rights. Democracy, as currently practiced, is critiqued as insufficient or even hostile to liberty.
That's a controversial stance, especially today when democracy is often seen as the ultimate good. But Weiss, echoing thinkers like Thomas Szasz and Sir Henry Sumner Maine, suggests that democracy can become a religion, an unquestioned faith, rather than a reasoned political science. He's skeptical of the idea that majority rule always aligns with liberty.
It's a reminder that popular opinion isn't always just or wise. The book stresses that inalienable rights act as a brake on civic action, driven by ignorant or tyrannical majorities. That's a critical distinction, often lost in political discourse.
Could you give an example of how majority rule might oppress minority rights?
Sure. Think about laws that criminalize certain consensual behaviors, like drug use or sex work. If the majority votes to outlaw these activities, minorities engaging in them lose their liberty. Weiss argues that such laws violate natural law principles and the indivisibility of liberty.
That's a good example. And it leads us to Weiss's critique of current American political and cultural conditions, which he paints in pretty grim terms.
Yes, he describes widespread ignorance of liberty, passive acceptance of despotic laws, and moral and intellectual laziness. The medicalization of social problems, especially psychiatry's role in labeling normal behavior as illness, is a prime example.
The medicalization critique is fascinating. Weiss draws heavily on Thomas Szasz's work, who called psychiatry the science of lies. The idea is that psychiatry often pathologizes normal human behavior to justify coercive control.
Right. And this ties into the war on drugs and sex work prohibition, which Weiss highlights as government overreach causing violence and injustice. He draws a stark parallel between the demonization of sex workers and drug users today and the persecution of Jews in Nazi Germany.
That's a provocative comparison. He's not saying the situations are identical, but pointing to similar mechanisms of demonization and exclusion. Sex workers and drug users become societal pariahs, denied protection, and subjected to legal debasement. It's a cycle that perpetuates injustice.
And the political parties don't escape criticism. Both Democrats and Republicans are faulted for failing to uphold true liberty and responsibility. The 2016 and 2020 elections are cited as examples of political failure to engage with fundamental constitutional principles.
The 2015 Republican primary debate on marijuana is a telling example. Candidates either pandered to the tyrannical majority or avoided addressing the fundamental right to physical sovereignty. None seriously defended the constitutional commitment to freedom and dignity. It's a microcosm of the broader political failure Weiss describes.
That ties into his critique of medicalization and prohibition. Drug prohibition is described as domestic terrorism, causing violence and injustice. The government's interference in private consensual behavior, including drug use and sex work, is unjustified.
Weiss uses an analogy of a security firm hired to protect the company, but instead harming its employees to explain the absurdity of policing consensual sex work.
That analogy is effective. If the police hired to protect citizens instead harass or arrest consenting adults engaged in sex work, it's a betrayal of their role. The only legitimate policing function should be related to breaches of contract or coercion, not moralistic prohibition.
And political parties in this context are complicit. Politicians pander to despotic majorities rather than defend liberty. Weiss calls for a new political movement, a third rail party, focused on strict constitutional enforcement and natural law. That's a tall order, given the current political climate.
It is. But Weiss emphasizes the role of citizens and moral courage in reclaiming liberty. Complacency, laziness, and conformity are major obstacles. He calls for a New Day's resolution, a daily commitment to liberty and responsibility. Ordinary citizens, not superhumans, can achieve this through disciplined, informed action.
That's an empowering message. It's a call to arms for personal responsibility as the foundation for national renewal. But it's also a warning against wishful thinking. Brutal honesty about America's condition is necessary. Skepticism toward received wisdom and political propaganda is essential.
The book offers hope grounded in a return to natural law and constitutional principles. It calls for a broad-based cultural and political movement to reestablish America as a land of liberty and responsibility. The legacy of Thomas Szasz and other thinkers is honored as guiding lights.
So to sum up, WISE's Reestablishment Project is a comprehensive, multidisciplinary call for a fundamental cultural and constitutional renewal of America. It challenges us to rethink liberty as indivisible, to recognize the failures of democracy as currently practiced, to reject despotic laws and medicalization, and to embrace personal responsibility and moral courage.
Exactly. It's a demanding read but offers a clear framework for understanding America's crisis and a path forward. The question it leaves us with is, are we ready to be fully born as Americans, embracing our unclaimed birthright to freedom and responsibility?
That's a powerful closing thought. Thanks for unpacking this complex work with me, Chloe. I hope our listeners find this discussion insightful and thought-provoking.
Thanks, Liam. It's been a pleasure. And to our listeners, we encourage you to engage critically with these ideas and consider your role in America's potential resurrection.
Today, we're taking a deep dive into a comprehensive critique of American society. It's a document that touches on a lot: education, political leadership, drug policy, psychiatry, and even the philosophical foundations of liberty. It's dense, sure, but it offers some sharp insights into what the author sees as a decline in moral and academic standards and a troubling erosion of individual responsibility. Chloe, when you first read this, what struck you most about how these issues are framed?
Thanks, Liam. What really jumped out to me was how interconnected everything is. The author doesn't treat education, politics, or drug policy as separate problems. Instead, they're all symptoms of a broader cultural malaise, rooted in complacency and a fading sense of personal responsibility. That story about the statistics course at Humboldt State University really stuck with me. Imagine a whole class where every student gets a B, no questions asked, no real evaluation. It's almost absurd, but it perfectly captures a system that values ease over rigor.
Yeah, that story is both funny and, well, kind of alarming. It really highlights how the erosion of academic standards can breed entitlement and apathy. When grades lose their meaning, students stop pushing themselves, and the author connects this to a wider societal acceptance of mediocrity. It's not just about education. It's about a culture that no longer holds itself accountable. But I wonder, Chloe, do you think this is a fair critique? Is it really just about lax grading, or is there something deeper going on?
That's a good question. I think the author is pointing to something deeper. This idea that when standards slip, it's not just about the grades themselves, but what they represent. Grades are markers of academic integrity and personal effort. When those markers become meaningless, it reflects a broader moral decline. The author also brings in the concept of cognitive dissonance here, which I found helpful. Students, and society at large, rationalize these lowered standards to ease the discomfort between their belief in meritocracy and the reality of lax evaluation. It's easier to accept a B for minimal effort than to confront the need for genuine achievement.
Right, cognitive dissonance is a useful lens. It's like we're all trying to protect our self-image, so we accept mediocrity rather than face the harder truth. But the author is clear that personal responsibility remains essential. Lax standards don't excuse individuals from striving for excellence. It's a call to resist complacency. And that complacency, as the document argues, extends far beyond education.
Exactly. The critique moves into political leadership, where the author points to figures like George W. Bush and Joe Biden as examples of ineffective governance and moral decay. The Iraq invasion, for instance, is cited as a decision prioritizing expediency over ethics. And then there's the mishandling of domestic issues, which further erodes trust. But Liam, do you think it's fair to single out these leaders, or is the problem more systemic?
I think the author is using these leaders as symbols of a broader problem: systemic corruption and complacency. The document draws on Hannah Arendt's concept of the banality of evil and the Milgram experiment to show how ordinary people, under authority, can commit harmful acts without questioning. It's a sobering reminder that passive acceptance of unjust government actions contributes to societal decline. So it's not just about individuals, but about a culture that discourages critical engagement.
That's a powerful point. The reluctance of citizens to challenge the status quo enables corruption and complacency. The document calls for a return to fundamental values of justice and accountability. And speaking of accountability, the author stresses the importance of honesty in public discourse. Richard Feynman's idea of abject honesty is invoked to highlight how transparency is essential for informed decision-making and trust in institutions.
Transparency is crucial, especially when we talk about property rights and cultural evolution. The author critiques arbitrary distinctions in property, particularly drug laws, arguing that respect for property rights is foundational for societal stability. The discussion of bodily self-ownership is particularly striking. The author argues that citizens have a fundamental right to access and use drugs without government interference, referencing Thomas Zazz's view that denying this right symbolizes a broader loss of autonomy.
And yet most Americans don't exercise this right because of fear and societal conditioning. The analogy of regulating cannabis being as absurd as taxing air really drives home the inconsistency and arbitrariness of current drug policies. It's almost surreal when you think about it. Medical marijuana users can grow plants, but can't legally obtain seeds. That's a perfect example of contradictory regulation.
That contradiction extends to the hypocrisy of bipartisan drug policies. Both Democrats and Republicans maintain government overreach despite professing support for individual freedoms. The war on drugs is framed as a central issue undermining liberty and personal responsibility. The societal costs are enormous: criminalization, violence, erosion of the rule of law. The author even uses a hypothetical example. If coffee were banned, it would create black markets and violence similar to alcohol prohibition.
That's a clever way to make the point tangible. And the document draws parallels between gun and drug regulation, both demonized due to irrational fears and government conditioning, despite constitutional protections like the Second Amendment. It's a consistent theme: the need to recognize individual autonomy and responsibility.
Another area the document tackles head-on is psychiatry as a form of social control. Thomas Zazz's critique that mental illness is a metaphorical disease used to justify coercion is controversial but important. The labeling of nonconformist behavior as illness and the dangers of involuntary commitment raise serious ethical questions.
Yes, and the medicalization of normal emotions like sadness contributes to overdiagnoses and stigmatization. The document contrasts this with behavioral approaches like counter-conditioning for fears, suggesting a less coercive and more empowering way to address mental health. It's part of the broader theme of government overreach and loss of personal freedom, a call to reclaim autonomy in all aspects of life.
On the philosophical front, the document revisits John Locke's influence on American founding documents, emphasizing natural rights to life, liberty, and property. It contrasts Locke with Hobbes and Rousseau, critiquing the latter's justification for totalitarianism and tyranny of the majority. The protection of individual rights against majoritarian rule is a key concern.
The Ninth Amendment, which protects unenumerated rights, is highlighted as being neglected by the judiciary, especially by figures like Justice Scalia. The author advocates for a secular, rational foundation for natural law to support liberty and responsibility, moving away from theistic justifications. It's a nuanced argument that challenges us to rethink the legal foundations of freedom.
Education is presented as critical for fostering civic responsibility and moral guidance. The current system is criticized for stifling creativity and critical thinking. There's a strong call for including philosophy and political theory in education to teach individual rights and civic duty. Parental autonomy is also emphasized, with warnings about the therapeutic state's encroachment.
The document stresses that citizens must be informed and engaged to combat tyranny. This leads into the discussion of bureaucracy and the tyranny of the majority. Drawing on John Stuart Mill and Hannah Arendt, the document critiques bureaucratic rule for enforcing conformity and suppressing individual action. The psychological impact includes a culture of dependency and loss of self-governance.
The erosion of parental rights and the rise of the therapeutic state are seen as symptoms of this broader trend. The growing disconnect between citizens and government is another concern. Arendt's observations on the breakdown of the public realm highlight alienation and mistrust. The distinction between behavior, conditioned responses, and action, initiative, and agency is crucial. The document encourages reclaiming agency and resisting passive acceptance.
Historically, the document draws parallels between the decline of the American Empire and the fall of Rome, critiquing American exceptionalism and its impact on foreign and domestic policy. The American Revolution is presented as a model for questioning authority and reclaiming liberty, emphasizing the need for a national realignment grounded in moral philosophy.
Finally, the document issues a strong call to action. Citizens are urged to unite in restoring liberty through active political participation. The idea of a new American honor society based on civic virtue and responsibility is compelling. It's a reminder that complacency enables tyranny, and vigilance is essential. Yeah.
So, to wrap up, this document challenges us to rethink education, governance, personal freedom, and civic engagement. It's a dense but vital critique that calls for a renewed commitment to liberty and responsibility. Despite the challenges, there's optimism that a virtuous and talented citizenry can renew the nation.
Thanks for joining this deep dive. We hope it sparks reflection and action.
Until next time.
Today, we're diving into a really fascinating and complex topic: how society, medicine, and law define and regulate drug use, addiction, and abuse. We're going to unpack some critical perspectives from a foundational medical text, Chaff, Goodman, and Gilman's The Pharmacological Basis of Therapeutics. Specifically, we'll focus on the chapter titled Drug Addiction and Drug Abuse, authored by Dr. Charles P. O'Brien. Chloe, this chapter is dense, but it really challenges the way we think about drug use and, importantly, the language we use around it.
Absolutely, Liam. Right from the start, what struck me was the emphasis on language, how the term abuse is often misused or imprecise, especially when it comes to drugs that produce pleasurable effects. There's this really telling analogy in the text comparing child abuse to child use. The idea is that no child should be considered merely an instrument for parental purposes. So abuse is really about misuse or non-use of expected care. Extending that analogy to drugs, the term drug abuse becomes problematic if we don't first clarify what drug use legitimately means.
That's a great point. So if I'm hearing you right, the problem is that abuse is often thrown around without a clear, consistent definition. It's like the word itself carries a moral judgment that might not be justified pharmacologically or medically.
Exactly. And that linguistic confusion is critical. Take marijuana, for example. The act of smoking it can be seen as either use or abuse, depending on who's looking and their conceptual framework. It's a perfect example of how language shapes thought, and, by extension, policy. George Orwell's observation about the decay of language making it easier to have foolish thoughts really resonates here. Sloppy language leads to sloppy thinking, which then supports unjust laws and medical practices.
Right, Orwell's point is so relevant. If we don't have precise language, we end up with policies that are arbitrary or even harmful. So, in this case, the term abuse in drug policy often seems more like a political or social construct than a clear pharmacological or medical fact.
Yes, and that's where Dr. O'Brien's chapter comes under scrutiny. He attempts to provide a pharmacological basis for distinguishing drugs like caffeine and marijuana, but the critique is that his analysis isn't dispassionate or purely scientific. Instead, it's influenced by socio-political biases. For instance, marijuana is included in the chapter on drug abuse, despite lacking clear evidence of physical addiction or toxicity.
That's a key point. Contrast that with caffeine, which is widely used, causes physical dependence and withdrawal symptoms, yet is socially accepted and legal. The document uses a great analogy here. Labeling all marijuana use as abuse is as absurd as calling all use of a garden rake an abuse of it. It really highlights the inconsistency and arbitrariness in how we classify substances.
The garden rake analogy is so vivid. It points out how ridiculous it is to label all use of something as abuse just because it can be misused. Not every use is abuse. And this inconsistency isn't just semantic. It has real consequences. These legal distinctions aren't based on pharmacology, but on cultural, political, and economic factors.
So caffeine withdrawal can cause fatigue, headaches, even nausea, yet caffeine isn't classified as addictive in the same way as marijuana or heroin. That's a striking inconsistency. It reveals what the document calls pharmacological despotism, laws controlling substances without scientific justification.
Exactly, and it's important to unpack the concepts of dependence and addiction here. Physical dependence refers to physiological adaptation to a drug, leading to withdrawal symptoms when the drug is stopped. Psychological dependence is more about craving or desire, often shaped by social or cultural factors. But, and this is crucial, tolerance and physical dependence don't necessarily imply addiction or abuse.
That's a subtle but important distinction. So just because someone experiences withdrawal symptoms doesn't mean they're addicted in the pathological sense.
Right, and O'Brien's use of terms like inappropriate use muddies the waters further. It's ambiguous. Does it mean accidental ingestion, prescribed use outside guidelines, or intentional misuse? And marijuana doesn't cause physical withdrawal symptoms, which challenges its classification as addictive. Yet, the chapter seems to treat all marijuana use as evidence of psychological dependence, which is circular reasoning at best.
Circular reasoning? Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. The chapter seems to say that marijuana use is evidence of a pathological disorder because it's illegal or socially disapproved. But then, the fact that it's illegal or disapproved is justified by labeling it pathological. It's a kind of linguistic and conceptual abuse, using the law or social norms to define what counts as illness, rather than objective medical criteria.
That's troubling. It suggests that the medicalization of drug use is entangled with social control.
Exactly. And that brings us to the broader concept of medicalization, the framing of social or behavioral issues as medical problems. Dr. Thomas Saz's critique is central here. He argued that drug policies are less about medicine and more about social control. The criminalization and pathologization of drug use serve to maintain existing power structures.
The document uses the analogy of a chemical loyalty oath to describe mandatory drug testing. That's a powerful image. Comparing it to McCarthy-era loyalty oaths, it really drives home how drug policy can become a tool for policing conformity rather than promoting health.
Yes, it's a vivid reminder of how these policies can infringe on personal liberty under the guise of medical or legal necessity. And the political and cultural reasons for marijuana's demonization are multifaceted. It fosters free thought, which the establishment fears. It competes with government-regulated commercial production, because it's easy to grow at home. It encourages peaceful behavior, which conflicts with the aggressive culture of the police state and military-industrial complex. And it challenges religious dogma by promoting a live and let live ethos.
So the opposition to marijuana isn't primarily pharmacological, but socio-political. This is why Dr. O'Brien's chapter, despite its scientific veneer, is biased against marijuana on non-medical grounds. It's a classic example of how science can be co-opted to serve political ends.
On the other hand, we have voices like Dr. Lester Grinspoon, who started with the conventional view that marijuana was harmful but changed his mind after reviewing the evidence. He concluded that cannabis is considerably less harmful than tobacco and alcohol. His prediction of legalization within a decade was optimistic, but the political backlash created a climate of what he called psychopharmacological McCarthyism.
That term really captures the social stigma and repression surrounding marijuana. Contrast that with Dr. Andrew Weil's findings, which challenge the impairment theory. Weil observed that marijuana users, when allowed to perform practice tasks while high, do not perform worse than non-users. This suggests that the so-called undesirable properties of marijuana might be more about social perception than actual impairment.
Weil's point about compensation is fascinating. Users learn to compensate for the drug's effects, much like alcoholics can perform better than non-drinkers when equally intoxicated. Since marijuana doesn't significantly affect lower brain centers, compensation can be nearly complete. This challenges the idea that marijuana use inherently impairs normal activities.
And the document provocatively suggests that marijuana's high might simply elevate mood from a low baseline, acting as a natural remedy for ordinary sadness or melancholy. If that's the case, why should such mood elevation be considered pathological?
Exactly. Especially since marijuana is non-toxic, non-addictive, and easily cultivated. The question then becomes, who decides what constitutes undesirable impairment? Is it the government, the medical establishment, or the individual user?
That leads us to the glaring inconsistency in drug laws. Caffeine causes physical dependence and withdrawal, yet it's legal and socially accepted. If caffeine were illegal, it would be labeled as abuse, criminalized, and likely lead to black markets and violence, much like alcohol prohibition did.
The document calls this Pharmacological despotism. Laws controlling substances without scientific justification. It's a powerful critique of how drug policy is often arbitrary and driven by political expediency rather than evidence.
Shifting gears, the behavioral science perspective is also interesting. Professor Mark Branch and Gene Heyman argue that addiction results from voluntary behavior and choice, not brain disease. They challenge the National Institute on Drug Abuse's definition of addiction as a chronic brain disease.
But their approach has limitations. They focus on operant behavior, contingencies of reinforcement and punishment, but don't address the socio-political context of drug laws. They also fail to tackle the ethical and legal inconsistencies in how drugs are regulated.
And their use of terms like rational and irrational choice is narrow, grounded in behavioral science rather than broader philosophical or political meanings. This limits the scope of their analysis.
Which brings us to Richard Feynman's perspective on honesty and expertise in politics. He argued that admitting ignorance is more honest and ultimately more productive than pretending to have all the answers. In drug policy, this means acknowledging the complexity and uncertainty around drug effects and social consequences.
Unfortunately, current drug discourse is marked by dishonesty and propaganda, which hinders rational policy making. The document calls for liberty responsibility. Individuals should be free to make choices that don't harm others, and society should focus on responsibility rather than prohibition.
That's a crucial takeaway. The broader implication is that drug laws and medical definitions are often driven by social control, cultural bias, and political interests, rather than clear pharmacological evidence. Precise language and honest discourse are essential for fair and effective drug policies.
And we should be wary of medicalizing normal human behaviors and emotions, like sadness or drug use. Doing so risks pathologizing what might simply be natural variations in human experience.
So, to wrap up, this discussion challenges us to question our assumptions about drug abuse, to recognize the socio-political forces shaping drug policy, and to advocate for a more rational, compassionate, and scientifically grounded approach.
Well said, Chloe. It's a complex issue, but understanding these nuances is vital for anyone engaged in medicine, law, or social policy.
Thanks for joining us in this deep dive. We hope it sparks thoughtful reflection and conversation.
Until next time. This document takes a hard look at the history and politics behind marijuana prohibition in the United States, especially focusing on the 1937 Marijuana Tax Act. It's a deep critique of how racial prejudice, propaganda, and political expediency shaped federal marijuana laws, laws that stand in stark contrast to the founding American ideals of liberty and justice. Chloe, what struck you most about the historical background Weiss lays out?
What really stands out is how recent the federal prohibition actually is. Marijuana has been used medicinally and recreationally worldwide for thousands of years, yet the U.S. only officially prohibited it starting in 1937. And that prohibition wasn't based on solid scientific or medical evidence. Instead, it was driven largely by racial prejudice and political motives. The document highlights Harry Anslinger, the first commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, who openly linked marijuana use to so-called degenerate races, particularly Mexicans. There's a chilling quote from a Texas senator who said, "All Mexicans are crazy, and this stuff is what makes them crazy." It's a blunt example of the racial animus fueling the law.
That racial prejudice is really central to understanding the whole story. Anslinger's racist rhetoric wasn't just a side note. It was routine and helped demonize marijuana in a way that justified harsh laws. The 1937 Marijuana Tax Act came after only 2 hours of congressional hearings, with very little medical testimony. The American Medical Association actually opposed the bill, saying there was no evidence marijuana was dangerous. Yet, despite that, the bill passed, pushed through by misinformation and political pressure. Weiss even compares this to Nazi-like intolerance, which is a strong but telling comparison given the racial discrimination embedded in the law.
Yeah, that comparison really drives home the severity of the racial discrimination involved. And what's striking is how the medical and legal establishments basically stayed silent, allowing these falsehoods to persist for over 75 years. The document really exposes how propaganda and pseudoscience were weaponized to manufacture fear. Take the testimony of James Munch, for example. He claimed to have injected dogs with marijuana's active ingredient, causing deaths, but admitted he wasn't a dog psychologist and likely never even used THC, which wasn't synthesized until years later. Then there's the absurd court testimony, where Munch said after 2 puffs of marijuana, he turned into a bat and flew around the room for 15 minutes. It's almost surreal.
The bat testimony is one of the most memorable examples of how ridiculous the official narrative was. And yet, despite the absurdity, Munch was appointed the official expert on marijuana by Anslinger. It's a clear case of propaganda overriding reason. The entire congressional debate on marijuana prohibition lasted about 90 seconds. One congressman admitted he didn't even know what the bill was about. The AMA's opposition was ignored, and false claims of AMA support were made. It's hard to imagine a more blatant betrayal of democratic principles.
It really highlights how little scrutiny the law received. The document draws a parallel between this and authoritarian regimes, emphasizing how the U.S., founded on liberty, ended up passing laws in such a rushed and prejudiced manner. Fast forward to modern times, and we see the Supreme Court case Gonzalez v. Reich in 2005, which upheld federal prohibition of medical marijuana despite state laws allowing it. The court relied on the Commerce Clause, which allows federal regulation of interstate commerce. Could you explain that a bit more? Because the Commerce Clause can be a bit abstract.
Sure. The Commerce Clause is part of the Constitution that gives Congress the power to regulate trade between states. So in Gonzalez v. Reich, the court said that even if a state allows medical marijuana, the federal government can still prohibit it because marijuana affects interstate commerce. But the document criticizes the court for relying on outdated propaganda, like claims that marijuana is addictive and dangerous, that were never substantiated in the original hearings.
Right, and Justice Stevens' majority opinion in that case is a perfect example of how deeply entrenched misinformation remains. He cited the 1937 hearings as justification, even though those hearings were so flawed. It's a reminder that these myths have a long shelf life in legal reasoning. The ruling effectively maintained federal prohibition, undermining state-level medical marijuana laws and individual rights. Weiss is pretty clear that this is a continuation of the racial injustice and a betrayal of American ideals.
And the critique of political leadership is sharp. The document calls out President Barack Obama, a former constitutional lawyer and member of a minority racial group, for failing to challenge these unconstitutional federal marijuana laws. It argues that Obama missed an opportunity to advance liberty by not addressing these racially inspired laws. The author insists that true progress requires a complete commitment to fundamental truth and constitutional principles. It's not just about marijuana, it's about physical sovereignty and self-governance.
That's a powerful point. The document holds all political leaders, presidents, members of Congress, judges, to a high standard in protecting these rights. The ongoing federal prohibition is seen as a stain on American politics, law, and medicine. It's a legacy of racial prejudice and propaganda that continues to undermine the rule of law and moral character.
So, Chloe, how do you see this history informing current debates on drug policy and civil rights?
It's a reminder that policy isn't made in a vacuum. Historical context matters, especially the racial and political motivations behind laws. Understanding this history challenges us to question the narratives we accept and to demand accountability from leaders. It also shows how misinformation can become entrenched in law and culture, making reform harder. The document calls for a re-examination of these laws and a recommitment to the founding principles of freedom and justice. That's a message that resonates beyond marijuana policy.
Exactly. The story of marijuana prohibition is a case study in how racial prejudice, propaganda, and political expediency can corrupt law and undermine liberty. The absurdity of the bat testimony and the dog injection story stick with you because they reveal the lengths to which authorities went to manufacture fear. And the fact that these laws were rushed through with almost no debate is a stark warning about the fragility of democratic processes.
So to wrap up, this document challenges us to look critically at the past and present. It urges us to recognize how deeply racial bias and misinformation have shaped policy, and to push for laws that truly reflect constitutional liberties and justice. It's a call to hold leaders accountable and to protect individual rights against unjust state power. For experts and anyone interested in law, history, and civil rights, it's a compelling and necessary read.
Well said. Thanks for unpacking this with me, Chloe. It's been a revealing discussion.
Thanks, Liam. Always a pleasure to dig into these important issues together.
Today, we're diving into a fascinating and challenging document, a series of satirical dialogues that blend real, partially real, and entirely fictional characters. The author deliberately blurs the lines between fact and imagination, inviting us to question what's real and what's constructed. It's a unique style, part dream, part reality, part satire, all aimed at provoking deep reflection on American society, law, and education.
Yeah, it's quite an unusual approach. The author even references R.G. Collingwood, who argued that imagining historical facts isn't essentially different from imagining pure fiction. So this isn't just playful storytelling. It's a philosophical strategy designed to reveal uncomfortable truths. It really challenges us to rethink how we engage with history and narrative.
Right. And that blending of fact and fiction creates a kind of intellectual tension. It forces the reader, or listener, to question their assumptions about what's real, what's imagined, and what lies somewhere in between. It's part dream, part reality, part satire, as you said, and that mix is what makes the document so compelling.
Absolutely. And the tone is interesting too. There's humor, but it's not just for laughs. It's critical and serious, aiming to provoke reflection and, ultimately, action. The author wants us to see the contradictions and failures in American society, law, and education, but also to think about how we might respond.
Speaking of education, one of the first major themes is a pretty harsh critique of American public education, especially at the secondary level. The author paints a grim picture, arguing that most citizens' perceptions are outdated, based on their own schooling decades ago or on biased media portrayals. But actual classroom observations reveal a monstrously deplorable state.
That phrase stuck with me. Monstrously deplorable. It's strong language. And the document points out that staged reports and local news simply don't capture the reality. Teachers are often forced to deliver formulaic artificial lessons that have little connection to students' real concerns. That disconnect leads to widespread boredom and a sense that formal education is useless.
Yeah, and it's not just the students who suffer. Property owners who pay taxes to support these schools often conform passively to the failing system. Even teachers who are homeowners face moral dilemmas, supporting a system they may not believe in. The author links this failure to a broader cultural demand for passive conformity and toleration of ethically compromising principles.
That's a key point. It suggests the educational crisis isn't just about curriculum or funding. It's deeply tied to cultural and moral issues. The passive acceptance of low standards feeds into civic irresponsibility, which we'll see echoed throughout the document.
So, Chloe, would you say this critique is mainly about systemic failure, or is it also about individual responsibility?
I think it's both. The system is clearly broken in many ways, but the author emphasizes that citizens, taxpayers, parents, teachers bear responsibility too. Their passive acceptance, or even complicity, perpetuates the problem. It's a cycle of disengagement and low expectations.
That makes sense. Moving from education to the broader society, the author highlights a general lack of individuation, true independent thinking, among Americans, even among professionals. Specialists like mathematicians or lawyers may innovate in their fields, but often fail to critically analyze the philosophical foundations of American politics.
That's a crucial observation. Technical expertise doesn't necessarily translate into moral or philosophical courage. The professional class, despite their skills, is morally and intellectually challenged in ways unrelated to their technical abilities. Divergent thinkers, especially speculative philosophers, face suspicion and marginalization. It's a kind of intellectual conformity that stifles critical examination of the nation's core principles.
It's interesting you mention that. The author seems to suggest that this conformity is a kind of social control, discouraging people from questioning the status quo. Even within the legal profession, which you'd expect to be a bastion of constitutional defense, there's a failure.
Exactly. The legal profession exemplifies this failure. The author notes it's easy to find lawyers for car accidents, but nearly impossible to find those willing to defend constitutional rights or reputations. This jurisprudential twilight zone means many citizens live as if no real law exists.
That's a striking phrase, jurisprudential twilight zone. It suggests a kind of legal limbo where fundamental rights are neglected or ignored.
Right. And that leads to a provocative claim. Being American is not automatic. It must be earned by actively defending life, liberty, and property. The widespread failure to do so means many Americans only qualify as so-called Americans. It's a call for moral and civic accountability.
That's a heavy claim. Do you think the author is being too harsh here?
Maybe, but I think it's meant to be a wake-up call. The idea is that citizenship isn't just a status. It's a responsibility. If people don't actively uphold the principles the nation was founded on, then their claim to that identity is questionable.
That brings us to the 2005 Supreme Court Wright case. For listeners who might not be familiar, the court ruled that federal drug laws override California's medical marijuana laws. The author uses this as a symbol of constitutional law's failure to protect natural rights, especially property rights.
The analogy the author draws is telling. Law students are taught that when you add 2 and 3, the sum can be 4 or 6, but not 5. It's a metaphor for legal inconsistency and illogical interpretations of commerce power. The Reich ruling violates biblical commandments against stealing and contradicts natural law principles foundational to the Declaration of Independence.
That's a powerful critique. The author seems to suggest that the law has become untethered from moral and natural law foundations.
Yes, and what's even more troubling is the lack of public outrage over this, quote, sham law. The author challenges future lawyers to reject such rulings and demand consistency with natural law and constitutional principles. It's a call for moral courage within the legal profession.
So Chloe, would you say this case exemplifies the broader theme of legal and moral failure in the document?
Definitely. It's a concrete example showing how legal interpretations can undermine fundamental rights, and how the public's passive acceptance contributes to that failure.
This also feeds into the author's broader argument about American identity. True American identity depends on active defense of life, liberty, and property. It's not a birthright, but something demonstrated through behavior. The refounding fathers and mothers must exceed the original founders' standards.
I liked the contrast the author draws with kindergartners, who often show more civic responsibility than many adults. Kids who learn to respect their classmates' belongings demonstrate a basic sense of responsibility that many adults lack. It's a stark indictment of widespread civic irresponsibility.
That's a sobering thought. And the biblical commandment, "Thou shalt not steal," is cited as a fundamental moral principle widely violated in practice. The disparity between professed Judeo-Christian faith and actual behavior is a recurring theme, underscoring the moral crisis at the heart of the nation.
It's a reminder that moral principles aren't just abstract ideas. They have real consequences when ignored.
This leads to the author's call for a, quote, gargantuan refounding project to restore liberty and responsibility. It's a rejection of complacency and passive acceptance of tyranny disguised as necessity. The current system is provocatively likened to a kinder and gentler American Nazi-like state.
That analogy is certainly meant to shock and awaken. The author warns that citizens must take responsibility for their own freedom and not be fence-sitters. Failure to reawaken will bring severe consequences: domestic decline and external threats. The nation is described as a fragile house of cards.
Yet, humor and seriousness coexist in this critique. The author notes that where there's a joke, there's often great seriousness. This paradox reflects the American condition, tragic and absurd at once.
It's a complex portrait. The humor doesn't diminish the gravity. It highlights it.
Shifting gears, the document also offers philosophical reflections, drawing on Bertrand Russell's idea that wisdom is emancipation from the tyranny of the here and now, achieved through impartiality and broad perspective.
Ironically, Russell himself failed to embody this impartiality fully, as shown by his personal family conflicts. The author uses this to highlight the difficulty of achieving true wisdom.
The author also employs mathematics and topology as metaphors for civic identity and social connectedness. Topological invariance. traits that remain unchanged despite transformations, are likened to the enduring quirks and behaviors that define American liberty.
That's a fascinating metaphor. It suggests that despite changes, some core aspects of American identity persist. But the author concludes that modern American culture is no longer topologically equivalent to that of the founders. There's a fundamental break, signaling the need to reestablish the United States of America.
I appreciated the personal touch with the pigeonhole principle anecdote, showing the author's engagement with mathematical ideas despite limited talent. It humanizes the philosophical reflections.
And the emphasis on imagination and daring speculation, championed by Einstein, is key. The author argues that political philosophy and civic renewal require creative imagination, not just accumulation of facts.
Finally, the dialogues include concrete examples of conflicts between homeowners and community associations, or HOAs. Originally intended to protect property values, HOAs often become sources of harassment and tyranny.
The author links HOAs to the broader social fallout from the drug war, which creates an atmosphere of legal threat undermining neighborly relations and genuine community. This leads to social dissociation and malaise, weakening civic bonds.
Without addressing these underlying issues, community and national cohesion will continue to erode. It's a vivid example of how legal and social policies impact everyday life.
To wrap up, the dialogues aim to educate citizens about the various forms of tyranny they impose on each other through passive acceptance. Only through education and active self-governance can complacency be overcome.
The author urges us to reflect on our own roles, active or passive, in sustaining or resisting the system. The stakes are high: dignity, honor, liberty, and the very future of the nation.
So, as we close this episode, I encourage listeners to think critically, engage actively, and embrace the challenge of refounding America. It's a demanding task, but one essential for restoring the nation's founding ideals.
Absolutely. This document is more than critique. It's a call to intellectual and moral awakening, and that's a conversation worth having.
Thanks for joining us today. We hope this discussion has given you some new perspectives to consider.
Until next time. Today, we're diving into a fascinating and, quite complex document called the Reestablishment Project. It's essentially a dialogue among neighbors in an American suburb, but it unpacks some really heavy ideas about liberty, law, and the state of the nation. Chloe, when you first read this, what stood out to you?
Hi, Liam. Yeah, it's interesting because the format feels so casual, like you're just eavesdropping on a neighborhood chat. But beneath that, there's this deep concern about America's constitutional inheritance and how much of it has been lost or maybe even deliberately obscured. It's like a raw, real conversation that slowly reveals layers of philosophy, history, and law.
Exactly. The conversational style makes it more relatable, but the ideas are anything but simple. One of the first big concepts that caught my attention was the metaphor of America as a shared inheritance among 5 heirs. Only some of these heirs really understand the true value of what they've inherited, while others are either in the dark or actively misled. What did you make of that?
The metaphor is pretty powerful. The car they talk about represents America's founding principles and legacy: the Constitution, liberty, the rule of law. But the risk is that some heirs, special interests, politicians, might swap out that valuable car for a worthless jalopy, fooling the rest. It's a vivid way to show how many Americans don't fully grasp their constitutional rights or the real state of the nation.
Right, and it's not just about ignorance. The document warns that without transparency and knowledge, citizens can't really claim their rightful inheritance. It's almost like if you don't know what you own, or if someone tricks you into accepting something worthless, you lose out. That leads us to the next big point: epistemology, or the study of knowledge. The dialogue stresses that citizens must understand how knowledge works to avoid being hoodwinked by legal jargon or political doublespeak.
Yeah, epistemology can sound intimidating, but here it's broken down simply. It's about knowing how we know what we know. The document argues that knowledge is the greatest weapon in preserving liberty. If people just tune out fancy words or complex legal language, they become vulnerable to manipulation. So learning to speak the lawyer's language isn't just academic, it's a civic responsibility.
It's a call for intellectual self-defense, and that ties directly into the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. The document reminds us that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, and the Bill of Rights was meant to be commonly read and understood by all citizens. Yet today, many Americans are ignorant of these rights, or see them as irrelevant.
The dialogue highlights the Fifth Amendment's protection against deprivation of life, liberty, or property without due process, but it also shows how entities like community associations often violate these rights without proper enforcement or citizen awareness. That local example really brings the issue home.
Speaking of community associations, the document's portrayal of them as microcosms of tyranny was eye-opening. Originally meant to protect property values, these associations often impose arbitrary and punitive rules. The character Uncle Sam I Don't Give a Damn suffers fines and liens for trivial yard issues, despite being a war hero. It's a stark illustration of bureaucratic overreach eroding liberty even at the local level.
And it's not just about the rules, but about the lack of real community spirit. The document calls it community dissociation, where neighbors don't really connect, and the associations become faceless enforcers of conformity. It's a powerful critique of how grassroots despotism can take hold.
That's a great point. Moving on, the document spends a lot of time on drug laws, especially marijuana. It traces marijuana's history from being legal and medically recognized until the 1937 Marijuana Tax Act, which effectively banned it. The document exposes the racial and political motivations behind prohibition, likening it to Nazi-like propaganda.
Yes, and it cites medical experts like Dr. Lester Grinspoon to show marijuana's non-addictiveness and medical benefits. The dialogue challenges common misconceptions about addiction, comparing marijuana to legal addictive substances like tobacco and alcohol. It's a strong argument for full legalization and removal of government interference.
The analogy to the speakeasy during alcohol prohibition really drives home the futility and harm of drug prohibition. It's a reminder that prohibition often backfires, creating crime and disrespect for law rather than solving problems.
And the document doesn't shy away from controversial points. It even argues for legalization of all drugs, including heroin and cocaine, pointing out that people can function in demanding professions while using these substances responsibly. That's a bold stance, but it's grounded in a call for personal responsibility and rejecting arbitrary government control.
That ties into the critique of political parties. The document calls Democrats, Republicans, and Libertarians anti-Democrats, anti-Republicans, and anti-libertarians, arguing none truly defend the full scope of constitutional liberty. The Second Amendment discussion is particularly detailed, emphasizing the need for a well-regulated militia and a free state, both of which are compromised today.
The call for a no-party party is interesting, a philosophical ideal where citizens unite by principle, not faction. It's a rejection of the current partisan bickering, and a call for disciplined, philosophically grounded citizenry to reclaim liberty.
And that leads us to the concept of the well-regulated militia. The document interprets this as a grassroots citizen army requiring strict philosophical discipline, education in political philosophy, history, and law. Guns alone don't make a militia. Mental and civic training are essential.
The warning against undisciplined militias is important. The document contrasts its vision with failed militia movements, like the Montana militia, which lacked philosophical unity and discipline. The idea is to build a modern citizen army of about 20% of the population, well-trained and principled, capable of defending liberty and the nation.
That's a significant call to action. Another striking theme is the critique of psychiatry as a tool of social control. The document introduces Dr. Thomas Azaz's view of psychiatry as a quote to label nonconformists as mentally ill and justify involuntary incarceration.
It likens this to modern-day witch hunts and Nazi concentration camps, calling the manufacture of madness a form of tyranny that undermines freedom. The document calls for outright abolition of psychiatry as a coercive institution, tying this into the broader critique of government overreach and loss of individual sovereignty.
That's a heavy but important point. The document also asserts that the individual, quo individual, is the most important and neglected special interest group. Society tends to organize around groups, but liberty and responsibility must be defended at the individual level.
This challenges collectivist thinking and special interest politics, urging citizens to reclaim their individual rights and reject group-based tyranny. It's a foundational idea for the document's vision of reestablishing America.
Speaking of reestablishment, the document paints America in deep crisis, economic, moral, political. It rejects the notion of a, quote, silent majority, emphasizing instead an outspoken minority capable of change. The founders foresaw the need for periodic constitutional renewal.
The call is for a reestablishment or refounding of America based on first principles of liberty, responsibility, and natural law. It warns against half-hearted movements like the Tea Party or occupiers, which lack intellectual and moral foundation. The emphasis is on a disciplined, principled citizenry to lead a true revolution of ideas and action.
And underpinning all this is the importance of intellectual rigor, language, and logic. The document stresses that voters must master language and critical thinking to cut through superficial political debates and ads.
The example of 1 + 1 being 11 or 2, depending on context, illustrates how understanding definitions and context is crucial. The document defines ignorance as not knowing and stupidity as not caring to know, encouraging self-education and intellectual discipline as essential to defending liberty.
It's a call to move beyond business as usual and build a new civic culture grounded in truth and principle. So Chloe, what do you think listeners should take away from this?
I'd say the key takeaway is that liberty isn't just a slogan or a vague idea. It requires knowledge, discipline, and responsibility. Citizens must educate themselves, understand their rights deeply, and be prepared to stand firm. The document challenges us to rethink what America really is, a shared inheritance that demands active stewardship.
Well said. And it reminds us that reclaiming liberty is not about half measures or passive acceptance. It's about standing like a rock in matters of conscience and being ready to act with clarity and purpose.
Exactly. It's a tough message, but an essential one. Hopefully, this episode helps listeners engage with these ideas and consider their own role in preserving and reestablishing liberty.
Thanks for joining us in this deep dive. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep standing for what matters.
Take care.
Today, we're diving into a fascinating and complex work titled The Reestablishment Project, QUANTAL Aspects of Liberty Integral to American Resurrection by Mark Stephen Weiss. It's not your typical read. This document is a unique satirical dialogue that blends real historical figures, philosophers, politicians, and even fictional characters into a kind of dreamlike conversation. The aim? To explore the crisis and potential rebirth of American liberty and culture.
Yeah, it's quite a ride. The document is part philosophical treatise, part social critique, part humor, and part political commentary. It's dense, no doubt, but packed with insights about liberty, law, education, morality, and governance. Our goal today is to unpack these themes and make them accessible and relevant, especially for listeners who already have a solid background in these areas.
Right, so let's start with the core idea, the Reestablishment Project itself. Essentially, it's a call for a cultural and political resurrection of America's founding principles. The author uses the phrase "QUANTAL aspects of liberty" to refer to fundamental, indivisible units or principles of freedom that are essential to the nation's survival.
QUANTAL is an interesting choice of word here. It suggests that liberty isn't just a vague concept, but made up of discrete, essential elements, like the smallest building blocks that can't be broken down further without losing their meaning.
Exactly. And the document paints a pretty grim picture of America's current state, describing it as being at hell's door, in need of a bloodless revolution or cultural rejuvenation. The author stresses that liberty and responsibility are inseparable, and restoring both is key to America's future.
That's a powerful framing. It's not just about political change, but a deep cultural renewal. The idea that liberty can't exist without responsibility is a reminder that freedom isn't just a right, but a duty.
Absolutely. And it's worth pausing on that for a moment. We often hear about liberty as a kind of entitlement, but here, the emphasis is on responsibility as its necessary counterpart. Without responsibility, liberty becomes hollow.
So the Reestablishment Project is really a call to re-anchor American culture and politics in these foundational principles: liberty, responsibility, and the indivisible quantal units that make them up.
Moving on, The document offers a harsh critique of American public education, especially at the secondary level. The author argues that most people are unaware of the true state of schools because their impressions are based on outdated personal experience or biased media coverage.
Yeah, and that's a crucial point. Many adults think back to their own school days and assume things haven't changed much. But the document suggests that's a dangerous assumption.
The metaphor comparing schools to concentration camps in terms of control and indoctrination is striking, and I'd say controversial.
Definitely. It's a provocative comparison, but I think the author's point is about the degree of control and the suppression of critical thinking, rather than equating the horrors literally.
Right. The idea is that schools today often fail to teach critical thinking, civic responsibility, or respect for liberty. Instead, they foster denial and complacency.
There's also a telling example of a high school principal who embraced political correctness and student dominance, illustrating moral cowardice in education leadership. It's a vivid illustration of how leadership failures contribute to cultural decline.
That example really stood out. It shows how some education leaders prioritize avoiding conflict or controversy over upholding principles or fostering real learning.
And that ties back to the founders' vision. The document emphasizes that education is indispensable to sustaining a free republic. Without a well-informed and responsible citizenry, liberty erodes.
It's a reminder that education isn't just about knowledge, but about shaping character and civic virtue.
Now on to Law and Liberty. The dialogue features key philosophical figures like John Locke, Thomas Jefferson, and Supreme Court Justices Louis Brandeis and Scalia. Locke's natural rights theory, life, liberty, and property, is central here.
Locke's theory is foundational. The idea that certain rights are natural and inalienable, life, liberty, and property, sets the stage for much of American political thought.
But Jefferson's substitution of happiness for property in the Declaration of Independence is highlighted as a source of complications.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness sounds inspiring, but it's less concrete than property. That shift arguably opened the door to more subjective interpretations of rights.
The document critiques modern jurisprudence for shifting from natural law to positive law, which is law created by human authorities and often used to control people rather than protect their rights.
That's a key critique. Positive law can be manipulated to serve political ends, whereas natural law is supposed to be universal and just.
The discussion of the Second Amendment is particularly interesting. The original intent was to protect individual rights and militias, but modern interpretations often stray from that.
The author draws a stark analogy between Nazi jurisprudence and the war on drugs, warning of legal tyranny.
That's a bold comparison. But it's meant to highlight how law can be twisted to justify oppression.
It's a warning against the dangers of legal tyranny, when laws become tools of control rather than justice.
The call is for a return to constitutional originalism and natural law to restore liberty.
The dialogue also delves into philosophical and theological debates. One provocative claim is that Jesus was not a Christian and did not found Christianity, but fulfilled Jewish law.
That challenges common assumptions about religion in America.
It also critiques Christian America and the addition of under God to the Pledge of Allegiance as violating the Establishment Clause.
The portrayal of God as a pantheistic figure who vanished, and the idea that God is a figment of imagination adds a satirical layer.
Woody Allen's quip that dog is God spelled backwards is a clever cultural irony, highlighting the tension between faith, atheism, and secularism in American culture.
It's a reminder that religion and culture are deeply intertwined, but also contested. On the behavioral science front, B.F. Skinner and Tom Zass represent the scientific approach to human behavior. The dog training example is a great metaphor, showing how a dog learns to like a bland biscuit only when it's part of a reinforced behavior chain.
That example really brings the concept of behavioral contingencies to life. The dog doesn't like the biscuit on its own, but when it's part of a chain of rewards, it learns to accept it.
Exactly. And this serves as a metaphor for societal conditioning, like teaching children to accept drug prohibition as good citizenship.
It's a critique of how society conditions behavior, often without awareness.
Skinner's later admission that positive reinforcement alone is insufficient, and that legal contingencies in a free state are crucial, is important.
It shows an evolution in thinking about how behavior and law interact.
Saus's critique of psychiatry and economics as fake sciences mixing politics and morality adds another dimension.
It reminds us that scientific understanding must be coupled with moral responsibility. The document doesn't shy away from political hypocrisy and moral failures. Figures like Bill Clinton and George W. Bush are satirically portrayed, with Clinton's moral development described as childlike, focused on avoiding punishment rather than ethical behavior.
Bush's private admission of rewriting history for political gain and the failure of leadership are also highlighted.
The Lost Nuclear Codes incident is used as a metaphor for leadership failure.
The broader theme is moral cowardice and the failure of leaders to uphold liberty and truth.
It's a scathing indictment, but also a call for accountability.
Which brings us to the call to action. The document urges Americans to become their own masters, rejecting tyranny and despotism.
Jefferson and Washington's support for universal education and active civic participation is emphasized.
Liberty requires constant vigilance and periodic exercise, likened to a, quote, moral equivalent of war.
The well-regulated militia is a metaphor for an engaged, responsible citizenry.
Proposed organizations like the American Liberty and Freedom Association and the Refounding Society of America are presented as vehicles for cultural renewal.
The emphasis is on truth, justice, and simplicity in governance.
The metaphor of approaching absolute zero in physics to describe gradually reducing crime by minimizing laws that manufacture criminals is a powerful image.
It suggests that less can be more when it comes to legislation.
Finally, the document ends on a hopeful note. Despite current failures, America can be resurrected through knowledge, courage, and compassion.
Imagination, critical thinking, and practical action are key.
It's a challenging but achievable vision. The Reestablishment Project is both a heaven of a prospect and a gentle giant.
It calls on each of us to consider our role in this cultural project.
So to sum up, this dialogue is a rich, multi-layered exploration of America's crisis and potential rebirth.
It challenges us to rethink liberty, law, education, and morality, and to engage actively in shaping the future.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that liberty is not a given but a project, one that requires vigilance, responsibility, and courage.
Thanks for joining us in this deep dive. We hope it sparks your own reflections on liberty and the role each of us plays in the ongoing story of America.
Until next time.
Today, we're diving into a fascinating and deeply reflective document titled The Reestablishment Project, QUANTAL Aspects of Liberty Integral to American Resurrection by Mark Stephen Weiss. It's a first-hand account that blends real classroom experiences with philosophical and mathematical insights to critique the American public school system. Chloe, what struck you most about this document?
Thanks, Liam. What really stood out to me was how Weiss uses his own experience as a substitute teacher to expose systemic failures in public schools. He's not just telling stories, he's weaving in logic, philosophy, and even advanced math concepts to highlight the disconnect between what schools are supposed to do and what they actually do. It's a rare combination that makes the critique both personal and intellectually rigorous.
Yeah, it's unusual to see that kind of blend. Real classroom chaos mixed with deep philosophical questions and even set theory. It sets the tone for a very different kind of education critique. So let's start with his experiences in the classroom. Weiss worked as a substitute in 2 different high schools, teaching 9th grade physical science and math. From the outset, the classrooms were chaotic. There were no clear lesson plans, no guidance from regular teachers, and students were often confused about what they were supposed to do. He describes asking students repeatedly which book they were supposed to use, only to get vague or no answers. It's a vivid picture of disengagement.
Right, and it's not just the students who were disengaged. The administration was equally problematic. Weiss wasn't hired as a regular teacher, and he suspects it was because he refused to be, quote, morally pliable. In other words, he wouldn't cover up misconduct or turn a blind eye to corruption. He even recounts an interview question that was basically a test of whether he'd be willing to ignore truth to be a team player. That's a pretty damning insight into how some school districts operate.
That really stood out to me too. It's like the system rewards silence and complicity over integrity. And the lack of support from administrators was glaring. In the math class, for example, Weiss tried to establish order and teach, but the department chair, dean, and principal were uncooperative. Eventually, after some parents complained about inappropriate language, he was removed without any chance to defend himself. Yet, he insists his language was professional, contrasting it with the students' often foul language.
That story really highlights the systemic dysfunction. The schools seem to function more like holding tanks or babysitting services rather than places of genuine learning. Weiss points out that this is a widespread problem, not limited to one district. The natural selection of weak or corrupt administrators who prioritize conformity over truth or discipline is a major issue.
It's a harsh assessment, but the evidence he presents is hard to ignore. Moving on, one of the more intriguing parts is Weiss's analysis of a chapter on drugs in the physical science textbook. The book states, the use of illegal drugs is another form of drug abuse. Weiss takes this apart logically. He removes the word illegal to question the legal distinction, replaces abuse with non-use based on the prefix ab, meaning not, and substitutes drugs with X to generalize. This leads to the paradoxical statement, the use of X is another form of the non-use of X, or simply, X is not X.
Wait, can you slow down a bit? That's a bit dense. So he's saying that by removing, quote, illegal and changing abuse to non-use, the statement becomes contradictory?
Exactly. The original sentence implies that using illegal drugs is a form of abuse. But if you strip away the legal label and look at the word abuse literally, since ab means not, then abuse could be interpreted as non-use. So the statement ends up saying that using something is a form of not using it, which is a logical contradiction.
That's clever. So Weiss is showing that the legal distinctions around drugs don't hold up logically or scientifically.
Right. There's no rational, physical, or pharmacological basis for distinguishing legal and illegal drugs. The legal categories are artificial and don't align with scientific logic. It's a subtle but powerful critique of how policy can be disconnected from reality.
And the students' reaction is telling. They asked why some drugs are illegal, and Weiss admits that science can't fully explain that. It's a moment of intellectual honesty that's rare in classrooms, especially when dealing with controversial topics.
Yeah, that honesty is refreshing. Then there's the math class experience, where Weiss brings in Georg Cantor's work on set theory and infinity. Cantor showed that the real numbers between 0 and 1 form a larger infinity than the counting numbers, which was revolutionary and initially rejected.
Right, Cantor's work was so controversial that he was institutionalized at one point. But now it's foundational to modern mathematics.
Exactly. Weiss uses this to emphasize the importance of the question being more important than the answer, which is a profound educational philosophy. He tried to teach these concepts to a disruptive 9th grade class, while also trying to establish behavioral standards. He used a mathematical analogy comparing a very small but non-zero number to 0 itself to explain why no talking and a little talking are fundamentally different.
And he also distinguished between ignorance and stupidity, saying ignorance is acceptable because it's why students attend school, but stupidity, especially regarding conduct, is not.
But the students resisted, wanting to goof off, and the administration didn't back Weiss up. The department chair dismissed his attempts to discuss advanced math concepts as beyond her knowledge or interest. Then, after vague complaints from parents, Weiss was removed without a chance to explain himself. It's a Kafkaesque scenario that underscores the lack of support for teachers who try to maintain discipline and intellectual rigor.
The irony is that Weiss was just starting to gain control of the classroom when he was removed. Plus, he was never given proper lesson plans or materials, just a set of multiple choice questions without answer keys. It's a clear example of systemic failure. Teachers are expected to perform miracles without resources or support.
Taken together, these narratives paint a bleak picture of many American public schools. Weiss critiques the idea of keeping kids in school as a goal if schools are merely holding tanks. Without genuine intellectual engagement, discipline, and ethical leadership, the system is failing both students and teachers.
And this ties back to the philosophical themes in the document, the importance of clarity, truth, and questioning assumptions. Weiss warns against accepting artificial distinctions or ignoring deeper questions, whether in education, policy, or society at large.
The title's reference to American Resurrection suggests that reforming education is key to national renewal. If schools can't foster critical thinking and moral integrity, broader societal progress is unlikely.
So to wrap up, the key takeaways are clear. The challenges in American public schools go beyond surface problems to systemic failures. Logical and philosophical analysis can reveal hidden contradictions in how we think about education and policy. And the human stories of teachers and students highlight the urgent need for reform.
I'd add that this document encourages us to think critically about the values our education systems promote. It's a call for intellectual honesty, ethical leadership, and a commitment to genuine learning, not just compliance or control.
Well said. Thanks for joining us in this deep dive. We hope this discussion sheds light on the complex issues facing education today and inspires thoughtful reflection.
Thanks, everyone. Until next time. Today we're diving into a dense and thought-provoking preface to a major essay that challenges some foundational ideas in behavioral science, especially those of B.F. Skinner. But this isn't just a scientific critique. It's a deep exploration of political philosophy, liberty, and the future of America, all seen through the lens of behaviorism.
Yeah, it's quite a mix, isn't it? The author, who's a behavioral scientist himself, spent decades studying and debating before he started questioning Skinner's ideas about how behaviorism applies not just to individuals, but to society and government. What's really fascinating is how this document blends behavioral science, political theory, and personal experience to argue for a radical rethinking of American society, grounded in natural law and individual rights.
Right. So we're unpacking some pretty complex ideas here. Freedom, control, the role of government, but with a behavioral science twist. It's a challenging read, no doubt, but packed with insights that anyone interested in the intersection of science and politics will find relevant.
Absolutely. So let's start with the background. The author's journey began with a phone call back in 1990 with Tony Nevin. For those who might not know, Tony Nevin is a respected figure in experimental behavior analysis, someone deeply embedded in the field.
Right, and they were talking about the impact of B.F. Skinner's death on behavioral science. At that point, the author wasn't even thinking about challenging Skinner. He was focused on updating a computer-assisted search program for behavior analysis journals. So his initial work was pretty technical and scientific.
But then, things shifted. Through email discussions on the Behaven list, which is an online forum for behavior analysts, the author started expressing what he calls meta-behavioral critiques. These weren't just about the science itself, but about the political and philosophical assumptions underlying behaviorism.
And those posts stirred up quite a bit of controversy. The author faced resistance, was often ignored, and realized that many behaviorists weren't prepared to engage with serious criticism of Skinnerian thought. In fact, he was labeled the asserter because of his persistent critical stance.
That's a pretty telling nickname. It suggests he was pushing boundaries that others preferred to keep intact. It also points to a kind of intellectual blind spot in the field.
Exactly. The author saw what he calls a gaping hole in Skinnerian cultural evolutionary thinking, something even the most knowledgeable members of the community couldn't fill. This experience marked a turning point for him, and it influenced his political views, which shifted from left to right and then beyond the traditional political spectrum.
So his critique isn't just scientific, it's deeply political and philosophical. That brings us to Skinner's political philosophy and how the author critiques it.
Skinner believed that government should shape citizen behavior primarily through positive reinforcement. That is, rewarding good behavior rather than punishing bad behavior. He saw punishment as ineffective and morally problematic.
But the author challenges this. He argues that Skinner's rejection of punishment is not only impractical, but also incompatible with American traditions, especially those concerning property rights and justice.
Right. Skinner's idea of government as a caretaker or nanny controlling behavior through rewards is criticized as a form of despotism. The author points out that Skinner's political philosophy ignores personal agency and responsibility, shifting moral responsibility from individuals to society or the culture.
That's a big claim. It suggests that Skinner's approach leads to absurd and unworkable policies when applied to real-world governance.
And the author illustrates this with a thought experiment about driving. Imagine a government program that rewards good driving, with tokens or money instead of punishing bad driving.
That sounds complicated. How would you even start such a program if drivers are initially bad? How do you measure good driving fairly? Would drivers be stopped constantly to be rewarded? And how much money would be enough compensation?
Exactly. The scenario quickly becomes laughable and unworkable. It highlights the absurdity of relying solely on positive reinforcement in government control. The author warns this could lead to a big brother state with intrusive surveillance and bureaucratic chaos.
That's a powerful example. It really drives home the limits of Skinnerian political philosophy. But the author's critique goes beyond Skinner, right? His own political and philosophical evolution is shaped by other thinkers.
Yes. He was influenced by John Stuart Mill's essay Asterisk on Liberty, which emphasizes open discussion and the importance of liberty. Also, Thomas Schatz's critiques of psychiatry and coercion, especially the idea that problems in living are not medical diseases, but moral and social issues.
The author also shares personal experiences, like jury duty, where he refused to violate his oath, and despotic work conditions. These deepened his commitment to liberty and responsibility.
He adopts a natural law perspective, rooted in the Founding Fathers' vision of life, liberty, and property as inalienable rights. He rejects both left and right political extremes, advocating a, quote, radical conservatism, grounded in natural law and individual responsibility.
That's a nuanced position. It's not just a swing to the right, but a move beyond the traditional spectrum.
Exactly, and he discusses despotism as a persistent, mutating threat to liberty. Drawing on Mill and political theorist Nadia Urbanati, he explains that despotism isn't just tyranny or dictatorship, but can exist within democracies as subtle forms of domination and inequality.
So Skinnerian behaviorism, with its control-oriented approach, risks fostering despotism under the guise of benevolent governance.
That's the warning. The need to guard against despotism is central to the author's call for reestablishing America's founding principles.
Another key point is the political blind spot in behavioral science. The author argues that behaviorism has largely ignored or denied its political dimension.
Many behaviorists resist political or philosophical critique, focusing narrowly on experimental analysis. This leads to a failure to address how behavioral principles apply to real-world governance and society.
The author calls for integrating political philosophy, natural law, and behavioral science to create a more coherent framework.
He even proposes a Darwinian analogy. Cultural evolution should proceed naturally within a free state, respecting individual rights, not be engineered by political institutions.
That's a compelling vision. But the author is also quite pessimistic about America's current state, isn't he?
Yes. He believes America has, quote, under the weight of its own decadent hand, due to complacency and denial. He calls for a reestablishment or resurrection of America based on a return to natural law and the founders' vision.
That includes a jurisprudence that unequivocally defends individual rights, a rejection of despotic tendencies in both left and right politics, and embracing open, honest discussion of controversial topics often avoided in political discourse, like drugs, sex, and psychiatry.
This reestablishment requires intellectual courage, moral responsibility, and a willingness to challenge sacred cows.
The author also stresses the importance of open discussion and intellectual honesty. He quotes Mill's asterisk on liberty and Montesquieu's asterisk the spirit of laws, on judging ideas in their entirety.
He criticizes the avoidance of controversial topics in political theory, which leads to superficial and ineffective policies. His own experience on the Bahavan list shows how resistance to politically penetrating critique stifles progress.
He urges citizens and scholars to disclose their assumptions and defend their methods openly.
Wrapping up, the author's work is a form of tough love for America, stern but kind-hearted. He offers a hopeful vision. By recognizing the nation's dire state and embracing natural law, Americans can lead a second-grade experiment in liberty.
The big question he poses is whether current generations have the courage, intellect, and heart to defend liberty as the founders intended.
And that's a challenge not just for behavioral scientists or political theorists, but for all citizens.
Absolutely. So, to sum up, this preface sets the stage for a radical rethinking of behaviorism and American society. It exposes the political blind spots in behavioral science, critiques Skinner's political philosophy with sharp examples, and calls for a return to foundational principles grounded in natural law and individual responsibility.
It's a dense but rewarding read, and it pushes us to think critically about how science, politics, and personal liberty intersect.
Thanks for joining us in unpacking this complex work. We hope it sparks thoughtful reflection and conversation.
Until next time. Today we're diving into a fascinating and often overlooked part of the U.S. Constitution, the Ninth Amendment. It's one of those constitutional provisions that's mysterious, neglected, and yet, as we'll see, absolutely crucial for understanding liberty in America.
The Ninth Amendment is the one that basically says, hey, just because we didn't list all your rights here, doesn't mean you don't have others. But it doesn't say what those other rights are, right? That's always been the puzzle.
Exactly. The text acknowledges that the people have rights beyond those explicitly listed in the Constitution, and those rights should not be denied or disparaged. But it leaves us hanging. No guidance on what those unenumerated rights actually are. This ambiguity has led to confusion, neglect, and frankly a lot of avoidance by courts and scholars.
I remember reading that even Supreme Court justices have admitted this is a tough nut to crack. Robert H. Jackson, back in 1955, said Ninth Amendment rights were still a mystery to him, and the court has pretty much sidestepped defining any specific rights under this amendment ever since.
Right, and legal scholars haven't been much kinder. John Hart Ely famously called the Ninth Amendment an old constitutional jester, more a source of humor and speculation than practical law. This neglect isn't just academic, it weakens the moral and legal foundation of American liberty.
So what's the fresh take here? I understand Mark Stephen Weiss, in his book, The Reestablishment Project, offers a radical reinterpretation.
He does. Weiss argues that the confusion comes from a fundamental misunderstanding. People expect the Ninth Amendment to specifically confer rights, like a checklist. But Weiss says that's the wrong approach. The amendment was intended to generally confer rights, broad, unspecified freedoms that protect us from government overreach.
That's an interesting shift. So instead of looking for specific rights, we should see the amendment as a kind of umbrella protecting a whole range of freedoms?
Exactly. Weiss uses a powerful analogy. Looking for specific Ninth Amendment rights is like staring at individual trees to understand the whole forest. You miss the bigger picture. The amendment's purpose is to protect a broad spectrum of fundamental freedoms that aren't enumerated but are nonetheless essential.
That makes sense. It's a classic case of not seeing the forest for the trees. But I wonder, why has this led to the amendment's marginalization? Is it just because courts want clear, specific rights to rule on?
Partly, yes. The legal system tends to prefer clear, enumerated rights for practical reasons. But Weiss suggests there's a deeper philosophical challenge here, which he illustrates with a Zen analogy from D.T. Suzuki's Nos. What is Zen? Asterisk.
Zen? That's unexpected. How does that fit in?
Suzuki explains that when you ask, what is Zen, the answer lies in the questioner themselves. The question and answer are inseparable. Weiss applies this to the Ninth Amendment. To understand what unenumerated rights it protects, you first have to understand who is asking the question. If you see yourself as a passive subject or authoritarian figure, you'll misunderstand the amendment. But if you see yourself as a free, responsible individual, the amendment's protection of unspecified rights becomes clear.
So it's not just a legal question, but a philosophical and self-reflective one. That's quite profound. It means our interpretation depends on our own conception of liberty and responsibility.
Precisely. Weiss argues that once we grasp this, it becomes obvious that the founders intended the United States to be a strictly libertarian constitutional government. They wanted to protect private life from government intrusion, guarding numerous unspecified freedoms.
That's a strong claim. So the Ninth Amendment was designed to prevent overreach by local, state, and federal governments into private lives?
Yes. Weiss even goes further, suggesting that overly intrusive laws that criminalize private behavior effectively convert private matters into public offenses. He provocatively states that the federal legislature must be considered a criminal organization to the extent that it creates crimes where none existed before.
That's a radical critique. It reminds me of how some scholars compare the creation of mental illness categories to social control mechanisms. Does Weiss touch on that?
He does. He draws an analogy between government overreach and the manufacture of mental illness by psychiatrists and psychologists, which he calls epistemologically invalid. Both processes create categories, crimes or illnesses that serve to control rather than protect citizens. This undermines liberty and the moral foundation of the Republic.
It's a sobering perspective. So the Ninth Amendment isn't just a forgotten footnote. It's a vital guardrail against creeping government power.
Exactly. Weiss calls for renewed citizen engagement and a clear-eyed appreciation of the Constitution's language. The Ninth Amendment's protection of unenumerated rights is essential for maintaining moral and rational continuity with the Founders' vision.
And without recognizing and enforcing these rights, America risks further moral and economic crises?
That's the warning. The amendment invites us to rethink liberty not as a fixed list of rights, but as a living, expansive concept requiring vigilance against government overreach.
To sum up, the Ninth Amendment protects rights beyond those listed, courts have largely ignored it, and Weiss's radical reinterpretation sees it as a general conferral of rights, a protective canopy over liberty.
And the Zen analogy reminds us that understanding these rights requires self-knowledge and recognizing our own role in the question. The Founders, libertarian intent and the private-public sphere distinction are key to grasping constitutional liberty.
Plus, the critique of government overreach shows why this amendment matters now more than ever.
Absolutely. It's a call to action for citizens to engage deeply with their Constitution and defend the broad freedoms the Ninth Amendment protects.
Thanks for unpacking this complex topic with me. It's a reminder that sometimes the most overlooked parts of our Constitution hold the keys to our future liberty.
Couldn't agree more. Thanks for listening. Today, we're diving into a fascinating and challenging document called The Reestablishment Project by Mark Stephen Weiss, published in 2026. It's not just another political manifesto. It's a deep philosophical and practical blueprint calling for what Weiss terms an American resurrection. Chloe, when you first read this, what really struck you about the scope of the work?
Thanks, Liam. Honestly, what stood out was how Weiss doesn't just focus on political or economic issues. He diagnoses a profound moral decay in America. And he argues this decay isn't accidental or incidental. Instead, it's part of a vicious cycle he calls behavioral momentum. Basically, once fundamental rights start getting abridged, it sets off an accelerating decline, not just politically, but morally and civically. It's a call for immediate, decisive action to stop this erosion before it becomes irreversible.
Right, that idea of behavioral momentum is really central. It's like, once you start losing rights, it becomes easier to justify taking away even more. In the public, feeling powerless grows more pessimistic and disengaged. Weiss warns that, without constant vigilance and active recovery, freedoms will just keep slipping away. It's a sobering diagnosis, but also a warning.
Yeah, and it's interesting how he ties that moral and political decay to economic mismanagement. He points to decades of policies, from the Clinton administration through Bush, Obama, and Biden, that have effectively sold off America through globalization, cronyism, and short-sighted decisions. Weiss even calls this process treasonous by early American standards.
That's a strong claim. But when you look at the specifics, it's hard to ignore. For example, the military's dependence on foreign manufacturers for critical components, things that are essential for national defense. And then there's the lack of adequate safeguards on imported food and medicine. These aren't just economic issues, they're clear threats to sovereignty and safety.
Exactly. It's a reminder that economic policy isn't just about markets or profits. It's about the very security and independence of the nation. And Weiss argues that such policies would have been considered outright betrayal in the early days of the Republic.
That's a good segue into his critique of behavioral science and psychiatry. He's quite critical of how these fields have been misapplied in modern governance. He references B.F. Skinner's Beyond Freedom and Dignity, and argues that behavioral science lacks the moral grounding and predictive power to guide society. What did you make of that?
Well, Weiss warns that treating citizens as interchangeable subjects in a grand social experiment risks sliding toward totalitarian control. He even draws a chilling comparison to Nazi concentration camps, not to equate the two directly, but to highlight the dangers of coercive behavioral control. It's a strong claim, but it underscores his concern about the loss of individual rights and responsibility.
Right, but he does see a limited, appropriate role for behavioral science, mainly in parenting and education, where it can help inform self-control and child-rearing without infringing on natural rights. However, coercive psychiatry, in his view, is a tool of oppression that assaults reason and liberty. He cites Thomas Szasz, a well-known critic of psychiatry, who advocated abolishing coercive psychiatric practices altogether.
That ties into the broader theme of personal responsibility. Weiss sees modern governance and psychiatry as eroding that responsibility, which is essential for a free society. It's a stark contrast to the classical philosophical foundations he champions.
Speaking of which, the document draws heavily on classical philosophy, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke and John Stuart Mill. Aristotle's concept of logos, the capacity for reason, is central. Weiss argues that humans are defined by their ability to act rationally, and that acting rationally is synonymous with acting morally. That's a pretty profound claim.
It is. And Weiss critiques modern government, education, and economics for ignoring these foundations. Instead of improving, these institutions have drifted away from the rational and moral principles that should guide them. He presents natural law jurisprudence as the key to restoring liberty and guiding cultural evolution.
For listeners who might not be familiar, natural law is basically a system of universal moral principles that govern human conduct and justify rights. It's not just abstract theory. It's meant to be a practical guide for law and governance. Weiss contrasts this with Skinner's behavioral determinism, which confuses ends and means and is fundamentally unnatural.
And he stresses that liberty isn't just a theoretical ideal. It must be actively practiced and defended. He warns against cynicism in political science, advocating instead for healthy skepticism that drives progress. The founder's vision, in his view, was a kind of scientific theory of liberty that has been prematurely abandoned or corrupted.
He even suggests that the great American libertarian experiment has hardly been tried properly because we veered off course too early. That's a provocative thought. What do you think about his take on leadership?
Weiss laments the absence of great leaders today, attributing it partly to the flight of genius away from public service. He quotes John Stuart Mill on how genius requires freedom to flourish, but is often suppressed by societal conformity. It's a vicious cycle. Without great leaders, society stagnates, and without a society that values freedom, genius is stifled.
But he's hopeful. He believes a critical mass of morally upright, compassionate individuals will rise to demand their natural rights, sparking a mild-mannered, but truly conservative revolution. I was particularly struck by his call for elders to become street philosophers. Instead of retreating into academic ivory towers, he urges us to engage directly with youth outside corporate-controlled institutions, educating them in real American history and political philosophy.
That grassroots cultural revival is essential to counteract what he calls the current de-education system. It's a practical step toward rebuilding a culture of liberty and responsibility. And speaking of culture, Weiss is sharply critical of mass media, radio, TV, the internet, for their stupefying effects that reduce citizens to interchangeable consumers and voters.
He recommends disciplined media consumption, giving incomplete attention while maintaining awareness of propaganda. That's an interesting strategy. It's a way to resist what he calls the is-ought fallacy, where people assume no action is required because others do nothing.
Instead, he envisions liberty clubs across the country, informal fun forums where young people learn real history and political philosophy, reviving genuine political discourse through writing and discussion. These clubs would stand in stark contrast to the 30-second soundbite culture dominating media today.
Weiss warns against the, quote, in circuses mentality that distracts from serious civic engagement. He even cites John Dewey's 1939 analysis of how revolutions often lead to reaction due to societal fear and desire for order. That's a cautionary note we should all take seriously.
Now, perhaps the most radical part of the document is the draft Declaration of Reestablishment, dated April 15, 2028. It asserts the right and duty of the people to dissolve political bonds with a government that has become tyrannical.
Yes, it reaffirms natural law and inalienable rights to life, liberty, and property, emphasizing the necessity of limited government. It directly accuses recent administrations, Clinton, Bush, Obama, of despotism, corruption, and betrayal of constitutional principles. The grievances are specific: refusal to uphold natural law, obstruction of justice, unconstitutional legislation like the Affordable Care Act, militarization of police, violations of privacy through IRS and NSA scandals. It's a comprehensive indictment.
The Declaration calls for a reunified system of American governance based on strict libertarian constitutional principles. It pledges mutual commitment of lives, fortunes, and sacred honor to this cause. Weiss frames this as square zero rather than square one, a fresh start grounded in constitutional fidelity.
It's a bold but constitutionally grounded call for a new beginning. And it ties back to the moral imperative Weiss stresses throughout the document. Passive non-resistance to tyranny, he argues, is equivalent to betraying those who fought for liberty.
He suggests that moral cowardice, not just ignorance, underlies the failure to act. Invoking Thomas Paine, he reminds us that freedom requires the fatigue of supporting it. The audacity of hope is defined as active dedication to freedom, responsibility, and self-improvement.
The document ends on a cautiously optimistic note. By embracing eternal truths and natural law, America can take a quantum leap toward resurrection. But it requires bold leadership and wise followership to restore the nation, and, by extension, contribute to the survival and flourishing of humanity.
Liam, after unpacking all this, what do you think is the most actionable takeaway for our listeners from this dense and challenging work?
I'd say it's the call for grassroots engagement, those liberty clubs, and the idea of becoming active street philosophers. It's a reminder that real change starts with education and community, not just political rhetoric. What about you?
I agree. Also, the emphasis on moral courage really resonates. Recognizing that liberty isn't just a theory but a practice requiring vigilance and responsibility is crucial. It challenges us to reflect on our own roles as citizens.
Absolutely. And understanding the philosophical foundations, natural law, reason, and responsibility, helps ground that practice in something enduring, beyond the noise of current politics.
Well said. This document is a call to both thought and action, urging us to reclaim the principles that made America possible in the first place.
Thanks for unpacking this with me, Chloe. And thanks to our listeners for joining us in this deep dive into Asterisk, the Reestablishment Project. We hope it sparks reflection and, perhaps, a renewed commitment to liberty and responsibility.
Until next time, take care and keep questioning.